In the winter-thinned light of a morning in the early 1980s, Janet Smurl stood in her basement, doing the sort of work that makes a life feel safely ordinary. She was 37, a housewife with 4 children scattered across various classrooms, and a husband settled into his long workday. The house was hers alone for a few hours. Upstairs, someone on the television laughed. Then came a burst of applause, thin, metallic, as if performed by ghosts who had forgotten the reason for celebration. The basement smelled of damp concrete and cold metal. Janet measured out the detergent into the washer, lifted the cup to her nose as she often did, and breathed in the chemical brightness that reminded her of clean sheets and Sunday mornings. Everything was practically perfect. Until it wasn't. As she pressed the start button, she thought that she heard her name, Janet. A light sound, hardly more than a breath. She hesitated, slightly puzzled, but the washer clattered to life with its usual noisy insistence, and she startled at its suddenness. She laughed at herself softly and turned toward the stairs with the basket in hand. Janet. The word was clearer now, shaped by a woman's voice. Janet's eyes traveled slowly across the basement. There were boxes pressed into corners, old clothing stacked in leaning towers, fraying cardboard filled with holiday decorations that glimmered faintly in the light filtering through the small windows. Everything was still. She told herself she was alone. Janet! This time, the voice came from just behind her shoulder, so near that she felt, truly felt, a small thread of breath against her skin. She spun, the laundry basket slipping from her hands and rolling into something unseen. Her throat caught on the beginning of a scream, and she stumbled backward toward the stairs, lifting her hands as though they might fend off whatever stood before her in the gloom. "Who's there?" she managed, her voice cracking. "Hello?" A sound rose from the shadowy spaces at the edge of the basement. A woman's laughter. "What do you want?" Janet cried, reaching the staircase. No one answered. Only the washer thumped and churned behind her, indifferent, and the television above continued its hollow applause. Janet took a step up, still watching the basement as though it might shift or reveal itself. She took another and another, unwilling to turn her back entirely on the room that had suddenly become so foreign. Then, sharply, louder than anything that had come before, she heard, "Janet!" She ran then, not bothering to gather herself, her feet frantic on the wooden steps. She burst into the kitchen and slammed the basement door shut so hard the frame rattled. The first years of marriage were bliss for Janet and Jack Smurl. Jack's job gave them a comfortable life, and they welcomed 2 daughters, Dawn and Kim. Janet decided to leave her job to become a full-time mother, and the couple lived happily with Jack's parents in Pennsylvania. But their happily ever after was a brief one. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes decimated the region, flooding their home under 12 feet of water within minutes. Everyone survived, but the house was destroyed. the family decided to purchase a duplex, with Janet, the kids, and Jack in one half, and his parents in the other. The building was old and needed work, which is why they were able to afford it, but it gave them a fresh start. Perhaps it was their especially awful circumstances that allowed them to avoid the whispers, but the property was quite infamous locally, known as a site of dark rituals and witchcraft, mysterious noises and figures in the windows, even when the place was supposedly unoccupied. It was not too long after they'd settled in that they heard the stories for themselves. But every town has a haunted house, Jack said with a smile. So they just shrugged off the rumors as tall tales. In the mid-1970s, Jack's parents bought a new rug. When they unrolled it, a large, wet, greasy stain covered the center, even though the rug had been pristine at the store and rolled up right in front of them. They cleaned it thoroughly until it looked good as new, and it lasted that way for 2 days, when the stain returned. There was no source coming from above or below, and the stain came back again even after they'd cleaned it once more and moved it into another room in the house. Eventually, it was rolled back up and thrown into a corner of the basement. But the house was just getting started. The family began dealing with a series of bursting pipes, and a seemingly random explosion from under their bathtub caused their porcelain sink to shatter and saw large chunks fall away from the tub. One night, Jack was watching TV when the television set burst into flames before his eyes. They chalked it up to an electrical issue, but other appliances ended up short-circuiting or lighting up in flames too. Soon, their daughter Dawn began waking up terrified, claiming that people were floating around her room at night. While normally a parent may be able to chalk this up to childhood nightmares, the mounting activity lent her words a disturbing weight. Radios turned on by themselves at full volume. Footsteps echoed upstairs when the rooms were empty. Toilets flushed in the middle of the night. And loud, persistent banging came from inside the walls. In 1977, Janet gave birth to twins, Shannon and Karen. By the early 1980s, the family had essentially accepted that their home was haunted and considered the entity to be merely annoying rather than dangerous. They had learned to live with the whispers and sudden cold spots, the inexplicable stains and the sporadic, sharp bursts of heat that made them leap from the sofa. They did not speak of it much outside of the house, with outsiders always having a way of mocking or misunderstanding, dismissing what one could not easily explain. So they felt it better, perhaps, to keep quiet. Yet the house had begun to speak louder. The foul stench appeared first in the early morning, when the light was pale and thin and the children were still asleep. It curled around Janet's legs as she made coffee, forcing her to gag. No matter how often she cleaned, aired out, or scrubbed the rooms, the stench returned, drifting from room to room, sometimes concentrating in the corners of the bedrooms. Jack tried to wave it away, saying it was just an old house smell or the plumbing. But his parents began to report more and more things that could not be dismissed. In the middle of the night, they could hear Jack arguing with Janet, shouting, cursing, their voices filled with rage. Mary would cover her ears, and John would head next door to see what was going on, only to find Janet knitting quietly, and Jack in front of the TV, with the twins sprawled out on the carpet with toys. Nothing had happened. No raised voices. Nothing. Soon, Shannon and Karen began to whisper about a man who watched them while they slept. At first, Janet hoped it was only something that they heard at school. But Dawn, older now, spoke about figures in her room too. Dark shapes that drifted and moved just beyond what she could focus on. One night, not long after, Jack awoke to the familiar pressure of hands on his shoulders. He reached up, intending to return the gesture, but his fingers met only empty air. Startled, he turned, and there was Janet, asleep beside him, facing the other way. In the weeks that followed, Janet found herself alone more often in the house, and the quiet began to unravel. One afternoon, she was ironing in the kitchen when a sudden wave of icy air rolled across her skin. A human-like shape stood just a few feet away, like a silhouette of shadow and smoke. Its face was blank, featureless, yet Janet knew that it was looking right at her. Then it moved, slowly at first, a cautious glide, before surging at her in an instant. She recoiled, bracing herself, but it passed straight through her. Panicked, she ran next door to Mary, who sat quietly in her chair. The woman did not look up, and for a moment, Janet assumed she was simply lost in thought. Mary had not fully recovered from a recent heart attack, and some odd behavior had become relatively routine. Then Mary spoke. "Death is coming for me." "What do you mean?" Janet asked. "I saw it," Mary whispered. "A figure, black smoke, came through the wall. Then it was gone." Janet tried to reassure her, to dismiss it as a shadow or a trick of light or mind, but inside both of them, panic had begun to take root. For a few weeks, there was a fragile calm. Then one evening, Janet was in the kitchen with her daughters. Kim's white communion dress was draped across the ironing board, the iron steaming steadily. A creak sounded from above. Without thinking, Janet and the girls ducked. A 4-foot light fixture crashed where they had just been standing moments before, barely missing Janet and Kim. Janet was struck in the forehead, leaving a smear of red, and a deep scrape ran down the front of the refrigerator. Days later, Janet had taken the girls shopping. Jack, exhausted from a long day, lay on the bed reading, and the book slipped from his hands as sleep claimed him. Hours later, he awoke with a start and realized he was floating above the mattress, suspended by some invisible force. He struggled, panicked, and was instantly dropped back onto the bed as if nothing had happened. That summer, the house grew bolder. One night, Janet was yanked from bed with sudden violence. Jack grabbed for her hand, pulling desperately, but the unseen force tugged relentlessly. Finally, it released her, leaving them both shaking and gasping. The banging in the walls grew deafening. The stench thickened. Their German shepherd, lying quietly beside Janet in the kitchen, was suddenly hoisted from the floor and slammed into a door. In the dead of night, a loud crash woke them. Rushing to the stairs, they found Shannon at the bottom, sobbing, unable to explain how she had gotten there. And the black smoke returned with increasing frequency. Sometimes it swirled, filling rooms like fog. Other times it took form, standing above the beds, watching silently for hours. Soon, Jack's parents awoke to find their mattress levitating. Screaming, they fell as the force vanished, sustaining minor injuries in its wake. Janet could not rest. The events were consuming her. She began visiting experts, consulting books, and even called priests to bless the house, not once but twice. Each time, the disturbances quieted. And each time, that calm ended, and the house returned with a vengeance, more insistent, and it was only beginning. Jack woke in the middle of the night to the low murmur of voices. At first he thought he was dreaming, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw two women standing in the corner of the bedroom. He reached over, shaking Janet's shoulder, whispering her name. But she didn't stir. Frozen in place, he could only watch. The figures became clearer. One woman looked to be in her 40s, and the other was much younger, maybe early 20s. They whispered something to each other, their words too soft and warped for him to understand. But what terrified him most was the sudden certainty that they could see him too. The younger woman lifted her head and slowly turned in his direction, her smile stretching into something grotesquely wide. Jack tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. The two figures just stood there, grinning at him. Then, in perfect unison, they stepped backward, and their bodies dissolved into the darkness around the wardrobe. Days later, Janet confided in a friend out of desperation, who put her in contact with a university professor known for his interest in the paranormal. He listened carefully, then told her there were two people who might truly be able to help. He slid a slip of paper across the desk. The phone number for Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were, by then, practically legends in the world of the supernatural. Ed, a self-taught demonologist, and Lorraine, a clairvoyant, had inserted themselves into countless major hauntings. To some critics, they were showmen, even frauds, but they themselves claimed to have investigated more than 3,000 cases worldwide. After the media storm of the Amityville horror, their fame was higher than ever. They agreed to visit the Smurl home. Sitting across from Janet and Jack at the kitchen table, the Warrens conducted what felt like an interrogation, asking whether anyone in the family had dabbled in the occult, or even used a Ouija board, or knowingly interacted with satanic groups. The Smurls found the Warrens' dramatic flair off-putting, but at this point, they were desperate enough to accept help from anyone who didn't immediately dismiss their experiences. Lorraine and another psychic walked through the house, and both said they felt an immediate pull toward the main bedroom. The moment they opened the door, They gagged at the foul smell the Smurls had come to dread. Something they couldn't see began to tug them toward the wardrobe, as if whatever lurked inside was drawing them closer. But when they opened its doors, the wardrobe was empty. Both psychics recoiled, describing a wave of pure malevolence that felt as though it seeped from the very walls. Later, Lorraine explained that she sensed 4 entities in the home. There was the spirit of an elderly woman, confused but not dangerous, a younger woman who was erratic and violent, a man with a mustache, furious and restless, and the 4th presence wasn't a spirit at all. It was a demon, one that had taken command of the others and had been living there long before the Smurls ever moved in. According to Lorraine, beings like this fed on fear the way we eat food. By keeping the household in constant distress, never allowing them to predict what might happen next, it could sustain itself indefinitely. Ed warned them grimly that the haunting was already very far advanced. The stages, he said, were always the same: infestation, oppression, possession, and, if left unchecked, death. And the Smurl family, he told them, was well past the first stage. The Warrens' investigation began that very night, and the house seemed to rise to meet them. Mirrors shifted on the walls. A television flickered to life, though no cord ran to it. And in the shifting gray static, Lorraine and Ed swore they glimpsed faces, staring back at them. After the Warrens left, the children huddled together in their room, shivering beneath blankets. Their faithful German shepherd, Simon, lay guard outside the door. But Jack and Janet could not rely on such protection. Janet sank into the bathtub. Almost instantly, the sensation that she was not alone crept up her spine. She rose to towel herself dry when a low, wet whistle drifted through the room. An almost playful sound that made her stomach tighten. The attacks that night were physical. Janet and Jack were thrown, struck, and slapped, the walls rattling with unseen blows that went on past 3 in the morning. The next day, on the Warrens' advice, the Smurls purchased sacramentals from the church and had a priest bless them. He was hesitant, skeptical even, but he did perform the rituals. The family left with the small items and a glimmer of hope, but it was fragile. They couldn't shake the feeling that the church regarded them with doubt. The Warrens, however, had a more urgent purpose: an exorcism. The Scranton diocese would need to approve and participate, but before that, Ed attempted what he called a religious provocation, a ritual designed to force the demon into revealing itself. During the ceremony, the invisible force struck. Ed gasped, choking, nearly unconscious, as something unseen pressed down on him. Then the bite marks appeared, first on Jack, then the rest of the family. And on the other side of the duplex, Mary glimpsed a dark figure in the doorway, a shadow that seemed to beckon her, urging her to follow into the waiting blackness. On the evening of June 21st, the house reached a new level of evil. Jack, asleep and unaware, was violently roused. On the bed, crawling toward him, was a woman unlike any living being. Her face was ancient and twisted, but her body looked young. Her white, matted hair framed a pale, scaly torso riddled with open sores, oozing a thick, dark fluid. Her eyes burned red, and her mouth, green and jagged with a few broken teeth, stretched in a grin that seemed to inhale the very air from the room. She climbed on top of Jack, and he was frozen. Beside him, Janet slept oblivious. And while he could do nothing, the ghostly woman began making love to him. Then, as quickly as it started, the creature finished and melted back into the shadows. When Jack could finally move again, he found that he was covered in a foul, sticky residue. He scrubbed himself in the shower until his skin was raw, but the places where the substance had touched him began to blister and break open, forming sores that mirrored the woman's own grotesque wounds. Janet, upon seeing him, could only collapse in tears. Dawn came to her mother, trembling, whispering fragments of a nightmare that described the horrifying encounter between her father and the ghostly woman. With the local church unwilling to intervene, the Warrens reached out to Father Robert F. McKenna, a priest from Connecticut they had known for years. He was stern, old school, and unflinching, and McKenna agreed to perform what would be the first of several exorcisms on the house. The night before his arrival, Jack was visited again. The two women appeared in front of him as they had before, but this time they were joined by a middle-aged man. He moved close to Jack's face while he lay paralyzed in bed, eyes wide with terror. "You will pay for this," the man hissed. The exorcism itself offered little relief. The activity within the house subsided slightly, reduced the noises and disturbances. But the relief was temporary. Illness began to sweep through the household. Ed Warren himself was forced to sit out of the first ritual as he was struck down by sudden sickness, while Karen, the youngest, became severely ill soon after. Bite marks and scratches continued to appear on the members of the family, on both sides of the duplex, leaving everyone exhausted, frightened, and desperate. Eventually, the Smurls packed their belongings into their camper van and fled to a nearby campground, hoping distance might offer them a break. But it did not. As Jack began tending the fire, their dog stiffened, growling at the trees. Jack followed the animal's gaze to a cluster of nearby bushes. There, staring back at them, was a young girl in an old-fashioned colonial dress. She stood perfectly still for a moment, then dissolved into the shadows as if the night itself had swallowed her. That evening, as the family huddled around the campfire, distant cries drifted through the trees. A small, panicked voice calling for help. Back at the house, the Smurls' neighbor tried to reach them by phone. She had heard endless screaming and crashing through the night, despite knowing that the family said they would be away. The call rang twice before it was answered, by a voice that was not Jack or Janet's. It was a little girl's voice, When the neighbor asked who it was, the girl giggled into the receiver and hung up. When the neighbor called back, there was no answer. The Smurls returned home to an unchanged nightmare. By now, they left every light burning at all hours, desperate for some semblance of safety. The children awoke multiple times each night, screaming from nightmares so vivid they seemed real. And on the other side of the duplex, Mary and John reported icy hands resting on their shoulders, chairs scraping across the floor, and books hurled from the shelves as though lifted by unseen hands. Ed and Lorraine Warren increased their visits, often staying overnight to witness the phenomena firsthand, meticulously cataloging the events. One night, Karen spoke up in a voice that was not her own, looking the Warrens in the eye and saying, "You cannot protect them." The words froze everyone to the core. Then came the ultimate escalation. One evening, the family sat in the living room when the entire duplex was suddenly swallowed in darkness. The air turned frigid, and the unbearable stench returned, thicker and more putrid than ever. Dawn and Karen clung to their parents, screaming, while objects from the kitchen, dishes, utensils, even chairs, were flung across the room. The television flickered on, static spilling across the screen, and the images were twisted reflections of the women, the younger and older, along with the middle-aged man who had haunted Jack's nightmares. Then the three figures appeared in the room, circling the family, whispering threats in voices low and cruel, as the children sobbed so violently that the room itself seemed to shake with their despair. And then, the figures vanished, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against their ears. Father McKenna returned the following day for a second exorcism, though he knew deep down that the rituals alone had done little to aid the family. He suggested that they go public, that a television interview might force the local church to take their claims seriously. But the decision to go public seemed only to enrage the unseen presence. On the drive to the studio, Jack and Janet were nearly forced off the road by some invisible force, narrowly escaping what would have been a fatal crash. Still, they made it to the interview, and to their relief, it went well. Sitting before reporter Sandy Underwood, they told their story. In the shadow of the Amityville horror, the nation was hungry for its next haunted sensation, and the Smurls had it. Media attention exploded. Television crews and newspapers swarmed the neighborhood. Streets were closed by police, and neighbors were furious. Dawn and Karen trembled behind closed curtains as strangers climbed the trees around the house, attempting to peer through the windows. Amid the chaos, a psychic named Betty Ann Moore visited the home and explained the behavior of the apparitions. There was an older woman named Abigail, who seemed to be confined to the upstairs rooms. Then there was a large man with a mustache named Patrick, who had a history of violence before he died in that house. Betty Ann believed Patrick had confused Janet for his wife Elizabeth, and Jack for Elizabeth's former lover. Then there was the younger woman, who was unstable and cruel, and who appeared to be working with the demonic force, seeking possession and violent ends. And the demon itself was a presence beyond any ordinary comprehension. Skeptics, of course, offered alternate explanations. Rumors of a potential book deal and the intense media attention led some to claim the family had exaggerated events for fame or financial gain. Parapsychologist Stephen Kaplan suggested that the Warrens themselves had implanted the idea of a demon in the family's minds. Jack's brain surgery back in 1983 was cited by some psychologists as a possible cause for hallucinations and shared delusions. Even the house itself could be explained by settling mines beneath the property or a faulty sewer that emitted foul odors. Perhaps, as is often the case, it was a combination of all these factors. Eventually, the Warrens organized a mass exorcism. Prayer groups gathered both inside and outside the house, focusing every ounce of faith and energy on ridding the home of its horrors. Father McKenna returned for a third time, and for days afterward, friends, family, and members of the church filled the rooms with whispered prayers and hymns, drowning the house in devotion. For the Smurls, who had endured so much isolation, it was a moment of fragile beauty and hope. Weeks passed with no incidents, and yet, 2 weeks before Christmas, Jack saw it again. A shadowy figure lurking at the edges of his vision, reminding him that the house's darkness would never be truly gone. The story of the Smurls eventually became a book and television movie, both titled The Haunted. With the proceeds, the family was finally able to leave Chase Street behind, taking their lives and their memories elsewhere. After they moved, the church reportedly performed one final exorcism on the property, and subsequent residents have reported nothing more than a quiet house.